morning, everyone, and welcome back to our next set of Embroider-along blocks for the Kimberbell Cup of Cheer quilt. Excited to have you back. So how much stitching did you get done last week? Did you get all the blocks finished and all your prep? I hope so. If not, it's okay. There is no time limit on this project. So just take your time, one block at a time. Today we're going to be looking at blocks that use a technique called trim in place applique. So we're going to be doing the star blocks 1 through 3, mitten block 1, mug 1, and presents 1 through 3. All of them are basic trim in place applique blocks that we have. The steps that are going to be involved in trim in place applique, this is whether it's a Kimberbell design or another embroidery designer. The steps to trim in place applique are pretty much the same. The first thing that we need to know is where to put our piece of fabric, our applique fabric. Okay, so you'll have your fabric in the hoop. We just need to know where to put our applique at. So we stitch what we refer to as a placement line. So the machine is going to run through and stitch a shape exactly matching the shape of our particular applique. The thread color that you choose to stitch this placement line in is really your choice. A lot of times I will stitch it in a color that blends into my background. It could also be a color that matches what you plan to stitch your applique down with. The placement line is not as important in terms of color. Once we have a placement line, we're going to take our fabric, we're going to place it right side up, completely covering all of the placement line. Okay, if we don't have fabric covering a section of the placement line, it is not going to get caught and will not be, we'll have a empty portion of our applique. So we want to make sure that we lay that applique fabric down so that we have every bit of the placement line stitching covered. You can put a piece of tape on it to hold it in place. You can just hover it there. Your choice, but I usually do watch to make sure that it stays nice and smooth for our tack down, because the next thing the machine is going to do is tack it in place. It's going to go and it's going to stitch that same applique shape again on top of our applique fabric to hold it to the hoop. Now this color of thread is going to depend upon, well, for me, depends upon what type of stitch is going to go over the edge to cover up the raw stitching. Okay, if it's a satin stitch, you're guaranteed that that tack down isn't going to be seen, because you're going to have a wide set of tight satin stitches that are going to cover it. If it's a raw edge applique or an applique that uses a decorative stitch to hold down the edge, I would make sure that your tack down is the same color as your cover stitch. Okay, so for the stars in this month, this week's set of blocks, it is a decorative stitch that is going to hold that applique fabric down. So when we stitch the tack down, I highly recommend that your tack down match your cover stitch so that it doesn't show through the decorative stitch that's going to be holding this in place. Once you have your tack down stitched, we can take the hoop off the machine, but do not remove your item from the hoop. And we're going to trim the applique as close as possible to the stitching line. All the way around, all the edges, we want to have everything trimmed as close as possible. And then once we're trimmed, we will then run the cover stitch. Now, sometimes in the design, the cover stitch will not be the immediate next step of the design. A lot of times designers will go through and have you stitch all the appliques in place first, and then it will go back and do the cover stitch. You'll find that when we get to the mitten block. We applique the mitten fabric, we applique the cuff fabric, and then it will come back, do some decorative stitching, and then it will do the cover stitch. Okay. One thing to note about the cover stitch. With the decorative stitch, you need to be as close as possible to the stitching line that you can be. What's nice about a satin stitch is that when we satin stitch, the system is going to run typically a set of stitching that you can see these two lines. So there's an outer line, and then there's this inner straight stitch that you can see here on the image on the right. The outer line is going to be the farthest edge of your satin stitch, and the inner line is going to be the inside edge. And typically after it runs that channel, it's going to come back and it's going to run a zigzag. Anything that is sticking, any fabric that is to the outside of that outer channel or outside of that zigzag is not going to get covered, okay? And we need to, before it starts to satin stitch, you may want to pause the machine and see if you can get trimmed even closer to that line. If not, you can usually we can get a little bit closer to the line once we get the project out of the hoop. Okay. But just that's kind of a little indicator when we have satin stitch covering, if you're unsure if you have trimmed close enough to the edge for the project. Now, we're going to be working on stars 1 through 3. There are 3 of them. They are identical in terms of what they look like, their technique. The embroidery design, the background quilting design changes, and the fabrics change. We need to, for this block, if you are doing the background quilting for this particular project, that background quilting is what's going to throw the hoop size to the next size hoop. Okay, so that star all by itself, doing the technique of not doing the quilting, the traditional embroidery technique, that star would fit in the large oval all by itself. Okay, but when we add the background quilting, so here's the large oval, fits just the star. But when we add the background quilting for this particular project, we need the 6x6 background quilting. Okay. So opening up that background quilting, it's going to take you from a large oval into either the maxi hoop or the medium clamp hoop. Okay. Now, for those of you with the BERNINA 5 series machines, you can't use a maxi hoop. And a design that's 6.5 inches wide is going to not fit in your hoop. So for example, if you're working on the BERNINA 590, 580s, you know, any along that lines, we don't have access to a maxi hoop. A midi hoop is going to be the biggest hoop possible that your machine can do. Okay, you'll see that when you open that background quilting design, that you have that red ring that appears around your hoop, which tells you that Your hoop, your design doesn't fit in the hoop. Okay. But if we look at this, the only parts that don't fit in the hoop are the very outside corners of the tack down. Okay. So if I add, you can see our star fits, the quilting design all fits, the tack down of our batting all fits. Okay, so the blue line is our batting tack down. The only thing that doesn't fit is the 4 little corner sections of the background fabric tack down. Your machines will embroider, okay? I can tell the machine, we're going to put a MIDI on, it's going to come up, it's going to give me this message, and I'm going to hit the check mark. We're going to work through everything just like we normally would. When it gets to this design where the portions of it stick out, it's only going to stitch the portion that falls in the hoop. Then we will, the system will come up with a message that says the next set of stitching falls out of the hoop. You just hit the check mark. It's going to skip that stitching and come up and do the next set of stitching that falls in the hoop. So we can get all the important things that are needed are stitched. It's just that outer tack down of the outside, the background fabric, that's not tacked down, okay, or held in place. It's not a pivotal part of the design. We're going to use our orange pop rulers, or we'll use a regular ruler to be able to square it up to 6.5 inches. So you still can stitch all of this in the hoop, okay, even though it says that it doesn't fit in your hoop. Okay, so don't panic in there. I am going to use a medium clamp hoop, and I want to take a moment to show you how that medium clamp hoop goes together. Okay, so the medium clamp hoop has just an outer frame, and then you have a handful of clamps. It also comes with the hard template, okay, that we use. We're not going to use the template for this particular project. The only purpose of using it would be to cut your stabilizer the size, and then you can use that to press your stabilizer down into the hoop while you put on your clamps, but it is not necessary. You have 9 clamps. Excuse me, let me do some more math. 12 clamps. We have 3 clamps for every side of the hoop, and we need to use all the clamps. So I'm going to take a clamp, and I am going to put it in the middle on one side of the frame, and then I'm going to come across and put it in the middle opposite. And then I'm going to repeat. Okay, so we're not putting all the clamps on each side. We're going to alternate putting on the clamps. A little bit on each side at a time. It's just going to kind of help keep this stretch or tension consistent. Okay, there is our clamp hoop. When you load a clamp hoop on the machine or take it off, it needs to be done from the corners. These clamps sit up too high to be able to clear the underside of your presser foot. So you have to make sure that you come from the corner. Now, if you remember from last week in creating the embroidery design, it's going to happen the same way this week. We're going to open up the design. I'm going to then add the star design to the embroidery quilting design, and everything is centered in the hoop. In my bobbin, I am going to place neutral color thread. In the top of my machine, I'm going to go ahead and place the thread color that I am going to quilt my background fabric with. Okay, so I'm going to be stitching the combination. This is my background, so I'm going to use white thread, and then I'm going to be using the green fabric, but use any combination. Start with any of them. This is the finished design. We have a quilted background with the applique star in the middle. Okay, so we're gonna, just like last week, we're gonna run the placement line so we know exactly where to put our batting. Take our batting, we're gonna place it right side up, completely covering all of that placement line. Once our batting is trimmed in place, we're going to remove it from the hoop. We're going to come to the corner, and then I'm going to trim my batting. Now, once my batting is trimmed, I'm going to go ahead and place my fabric on top of this. If you remember, the next color stop on the design actually would give you a fabric placement line, but I mean, I know exactly where this fabric needs to go for the most part. So we're just going to kind of center it over top of our batting. And then I'm going to pop this back on the machine, and we are going to skip color stop 3. I'm going to stitch color stop 4, which is the final tack down of fabric. And then we're going to run the quilting. Okay, once my quilting's complete, I'm going to change my upper thread to the color that is going to match my fabric, so that my tack down, my placement line, my tack down, and my cover stitch are all going to be done for me in the green, which is 5833 in Isacord. So we need to know where to put this piece of fabric. Now, it's big enough that we could probably guess, but we're not going to guess because they've given us a placement line. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch the next color stop, which is going to give us an outline of our star and tell us exactly where we need to put this piece of fabric. We're going to take our piece of fabric right side up. We're going to cover that up, making sure that all of our placement lines are hidden underneath the applique fabric. If you would like, you can take and place a piece of tape there to hold it in place. I'm going to just kind of guide my hand around, and we're going to tack this down. Our fabric is tacked down. I'm going to go ahead and take my hoop off the machine, and I'm going to place it on a nice flat surface here. And we're going to remove the excess fabric from around the edge all the way as close to the stitching line as you can get. Now I find if you put a little tension on the fabric that you're trimming, okay, so I'm kind of pulling on this, it cuts a little cleaner, and I can make sure that I'm getting as close to that edge as possible. It's very, very close to that stitching line. We're going to get my hoop right here. Return it to the machine, and we're going to stitch the next color stop, which is the final color stop, which is going to be the decorative stitch that is going to stitch around our star and as well as stitch in the center. Once your design is finished, there he is. You're going to repeat 2 more times with 2 other particular color combinations that are in the machine. All of these star blocks are going to get finished up and trimmed to a 6.5 inch square. We just finished, and we are going to use the orange pop rulers again, like we talked about last week. The 6.5 inch square is the middle size, and then I always like to take the next one bigger so that I have just a little bit more room for my hands. It's pretty close to being lined up on that background fabric tack down. And I'm just going to very carefully, again, a rotating mat would be really good for this, but one has still not made it into the studio down here. Okay. And then there are your 3 star blocks for your quilt. So we're going to take and set those to the side. Now we're going to talk about mittens. Okay. Mittens, the mitten block, mitten number 1. Okay, there are 2 mitten blocks. The second mitten block we'll do when we talk about making pockets. Okay. This is done in your large oval. It is 4.5 by 6.5. So you're going to be using the 4 by 6 quilting design for the project. All right, so you can see we have our 4 by 6 design, and then we're going to add the mitten to it. The mitten stays centered. The design is centered. It may not look centered, but it is positioned exactly where it needs to be. You'll notice that with this design, there are some trimming guides that are part of the design, and that is designed to help keep this centered or in the exact location that it needs to be, because we don't want this particular block actually, the mitten itself actually centered in the block, if that makes sense. Now, there are special trimming instructions for this that I'll go over here in a moment. This is a double applique block, okay? So after we do all the steps of quilting, it's going to run the placement line for the body of our mitten. We're going to tack that fabric down, and then it's going to move to the placement line for the cuff, and then a tack down of the cuff. Make sure that you pay attention to the placement of your cuff fabric, that cuff fabric is a stripe. So if you want the stripe to go straight up and down, left to right, on a diagonal, just kind of make sure that you position your fabric the way that you would like your cuff stripe to show up in your block. Once our cuff fabric is appliqued and trimmed, the design moves on to stitching the rickrack, the little Nordic star, and then it has these polka dots. Okay, so let's talk about these polka dots for a minute, because we have on our machines, most of the machines today have the ability to trim jump stitches. And it's a wonderful thing to have. But with the jump stitch trimming, every time we jump, it is going to tie a knot before it cuts. It's going to jump and then tie a knot again, where it's going to be starting. Okay, so if I look here, it would tie a knot right here at the beginning. It's going to do a little bit of stitching and then tie another knot in the same area and then jump. Those little dots are very tiny. Okay, you're going to have a knot, a little bit of stitching, and then another knot, all within a very small area. And to save you some of a headache, maybe, I mean, it may work fine, but I recommend turning off your jump stitch cutting for this step. And then I'm going to show you how to properly trim the jump stitches that are jumped between all those little polka dots. To turn off the jump stitch cutting, you can, this little guy right here on the BERNINAs, the scissors between the two squares, if we touch that, it is no longer yellow, okay? If it's yellow, it's turned on. If it's not yellow, it's turned off. So we would turn it off to do this color stop, and then you can turn it back on after that particular color stop is done. We will then move to the satin stitch that goes around the body of the mitten, and then the satin stitch for the cuff. And then the final color stop is going to stitch a straight line at the top and a little straight line at the bottom. That color really doesn't matter as to what you chose. I did mine in the same green that went around my cuff, so I didn't have to thread my machine again. That purpose of that is to for us to be able to trim, but it's also there to help keep the machine from putting that mitten back into the center of this rectangle. And it's going to be covered up when we do the trimming, or it'll be covered up when we do the final assembly, so it really doesn't matter what you stitch it in. Okay, so let me show you the mitten. Okay, there's our mitten. I'm going to zoom into the mitten so that you can see. So here's that placement line, trim line right there. And we've got one down here at the bottom. But I specifically want to talk about these polka dots. Now it's only going to take me a few minutes. I have plenty of blocks. I can be doing this while the machine is running another color stop. So it's not any big of a deal to sit and trim these. I'm using a pair of scissors that are called Snip-a-Stitch. They have a little tiny hook on one end. You don't have to use the Snip-a-Stitches. You can just use a regular pair of trimming scissors. These are just all pointed. You can use another pair, we just want a small scissor, but I highly recommend a pair of tweezers. Okay. This is the pair of tweezers that from BERNINA, okay? But I prefer a pair of tweezers, they call them Swiss style. So the head is turned at a 90-degree angle. These are not tweezers that you would pluck your eyebrows with. We want them to be kind of at an angle because this is going to allow me to hold on to this thread after I clip it so that I can get a nice clip on the second one. Because if you've ever clipped a jump stitch, you can get a good cut on the first one, but the second end, if you're not holding on to it, it usually ends up leaving some fuzzies or you can't get as close as you want. So I take my tweezers, I grab a hold of the jump stitch. I'm going to come in, I'm going to clip it while still holding on to it. It's, you know, I've released it. I'm kind of pulling up on it so that I can clip there, and that gives me a clean cut. Okay, so you can see holding on to it. Maybe. Clip. I'm kind of pulling up while I clip, and now I have a clean cut. Okay. And I would just work through clipping all of those, you know, while you're in front of the TV, while you are, you know, waiting on another long color stop. Anything along that lines. Okay. Working around, clipping. You could go through and you could clip all the one sides and then come back with your tweezers. Again, doesn't have to be the snip a stitch. Any sort of tweezer that you can get under. That one. Now, he looks no different now than if I had done it with machine. It's actually a lot less knotty and better looking on the underside and saved me a big headache. So I will continue on clipping these. I waited until I got it out of the hoop. You could do it before you continued on in your stitching, but I just went ahead and left it. There's no reason to do them in between color stops. There's nothing in, I can still get that jump stitch and that jump stitch which were close to the satin stitching. We're trimming this to 4.5 by 6.5, which is the middle size, the small size rectangle. And I'm just going to position that so that the trim lines are centered. Okay, again, pretty much I didn't have a lot of shrinkage, so that tack down that's holding my background fabric is right at the edge of where I'm going to cut. I'm going to throw in the next size orange pop so that I have a little bit more space for my hand, and I'm going to trim all the way around. And there's my mitten block. And I'll finish trimming that up after we get the machine started again with the next block. Okay, so our next block that we're going to cover is going to be the mug. Okay, so our mug block, we're only doing mug 1 because mug 2 has a different technique to it. So again, that medium clamp or maxi hoop or doing the technique, if you don't have a machine that's capable of either of those. The embroidery design, when you add the two designs together, are going to be centered inside of each other. So we have the cup quilting design that is in the 6x6 file, and then we're going to add the mug to it. Okay. Fusible on the back of our background, but there is a note to apply a piece of fusible woven to the applique fabric as well. Okay, and part of that reason is to help prevent the stripe from shadowing through this lighter fabric. There is also a step in this project, in this hoop, this design, that uses your Velcro dots again. So I've got to find my Velcro. Okay. This project is going to be using the little dots of Velcro. So we want the Velcro dots that are the rougher ones. Leave the smooth ones in the bag. And the 6x6 design, and then I'm going to add the cup to it and leave it exactly where it's at. So you can see here, I have my quilting design, which is the cup in the 6x6, and then I added our embroidery design to that file, leaving it exactly in the center. I'm going to thread my machine in the color that I want a background quilt in, and I'm going to background quilt in red. I'll probably lose this game of bobbin chicken that's going to happen, so I'm going to change my bobbin because my machine is telling me it's almost empty. So since I'm starting the design, I might as well go ahead and change it. Yep, almost empty. And we're going to run the placement line for our batting. Batting goes down. Tack our batting in place. Now that our batting is tacked down, we're going to pop that off the machine, bring it over to a nice flat surface, and trim the batting from the outer edge. By trimming this batting from the outer edge, we're removing it from what will be the seam allowance for when we go to sew the project together. Now, the next thing that we need to do is place our fabric. What you need to note is this cup is done. Here's the clamp of my hoop. This is the top of the cup here. Okay, so if you have a preference for your stripe, I would take a look at that as you put your fabric into the hoop. Okay, this is the top of your cup. This is the handle of your cup. Okay, I think I like that way. Once I'm good there, we're going to return this to the machine. I'm going to skip color stop 3, and I'm going to stitch color stop 4. And now we quilt. Okay, after your quilting's done, the next steps are to walk through appliquing the cup. So I'm going to change my thread to a gray. Isocord 142. And I'm going to run my placement line. Now that my placement line is down there, I'm going to place my applique fabric right side up, completely covering all of that placement line. And we're going to tack it in place. We're going to pull it off of the machine, and we're going to trim the applique fabric from around the edge. We're going to come back to the machine, and the next color stop is going to run the cover stitch and the rim and the handle. The outline is done, and the rim we're going to change to the color of our hot cocoa on the inside. So I'm changing over to dark brown, Isocord 1876. Next color stop is going to it's going to stitch the rim of the cup. Now we don't want to use the same color as the gray originally, because it will end up blending in with the inside of the cup. So a darker gray or black. If you look at the picture on the front of the project, it looks like it's black. Now we're going to do the number in the middle of our cup in the color of your choice, but I'm going to do it in red. All right, the last color stop is we're going to work through adding the placement for our Velcro dots and then stitching the dots down. This is done the same way as we did the Velcro dot last week on the letter E, except this time we're using the smaller dot and the rough side of the Velcro. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to load white thread in the machine. We're going to run the placement line. It's going to stitch us 3 small circles. We're now going to place the small rough side of the Velcro over top of each of those circles. Then we're going to run the color stop to tack them in place. Our mug 1 is now complete. This will hold our little wool felt balls to make it look like marshmallows on top of our hot chocolate. We're going to work now on the final blocks, which are presents 1 through 3. These are all identical in terms of their fabrics. The only difference is going to be the background quilting design. 2 of them have the stockings and 1 of them has the branch on it. We are using the large oval hoop for this project. We are going to need a piece of wash away topping for each of them. And so we want the clear Stitch 2.0 aqua film type topping for it. I'm going to also need some ribbon, and this ribbon is in your kit that we have. So let me show you. It is in the embellishment kit, it is the 1/8 inch wide grosgrain ribbon that's in the package with the red and white twine. We're going to cut that into 9-inch links. We need 4 9-inch pieces for each present. Okay, so 12 9-inch pieces total. You're going to run through and go ahead and stitch everything related to getting your batting in place, your background fabric, and all of that. All good to go. Just like we've done in all the previous blocks. After your quilting is finished, I'm going to go ahead and change to the thread color that I'm going to do my applique in. And I'm going to run the color stop. The color stop is going to stitch me some ribbon placement lines. Okay, so there'll be 1 line on each side of what will become our present. So we're going to stitch that color, and I've already stitched it here. And we're going to take our ribbon, okay, those 9-inch pieces of ribbon. Now I have heat sealed the ends of my ribbon, okay. So I took a lighter and I just lightly went over the edge of this grosgrain to kind of melt the edges to seal it so it won't ravel on me. If you're not using grosgrain or the ribbon from the embellishment kit, I would do heat sealing very cautiously because you don't want to catch anything on fire. So definitely do it by a water source. But grosgrain melts when you just tap it with a little bit of heat. So we have those 4 lines. We're going to take this ribbon. We're going to overlap the line about 1/4 inch so that it's to the inside. I want the excess of the ribbon to the outside, and then we're going to tape it in place. Okay, so we're going to do that on all 4 sides. And once we have all 4 pieces of ribbon in place, I'm going to run the tack down for the ribbon, and we're going to stitch basically 4 little lines to hold our ribbons in place. Just make sure you have your excess ribbon kind of to the outside. Once the ribbon is stitched, we are going to very carefully remove the tape. We don't want to pull too tightly and tear ribbon. After your tape is removed, we're going to take that piece of wash away topping and we're going to cover all of that area where the ribbons are. Okay, and so the purpose of this wash away topping is just to make sure that our foot doesn't get caught up in those ribbons. Okay, so I'm gonna tape my wash away down, just top and bottom, and then I'm going to put my hoop back on the machine and we're going to run the next color stop, which is going to stitch the placement line for our fabric. Now, before we put our fabric down, she has you remove the wash away stabilizer from the inside. You can, for the most part, it should tear, but if it doesn't want to tear easily, just take your scissors and run along the inside. Wouldn't necessarily need to remove it. It'll get washed in, it'll disappear in the wash for the most part, but we'll go ahead and take it out. I'm now going to put my fabric right side up, covering all of that open area, and we're going to tack it in place. When our fabric is tacked down, we're going to carefully remove the hoop from the machine. We're going to trim just the fabric from around the edge. I don't want to cut the topping, and I don't want to cut the ribbons. That's really the reason for the topping more than anything, is so that when we go to trim this, we don't accidentally cut ribbon. Okay, now we are trimmed. We're going to return this to the machine, and we're going to stitch the final color stop, which is just going to stitch us the satin stitch around the edge of our fabric. When your stitching is done, we're going to take the hoop off the machine. We'll take the item out of the hoop, and we can remove the rest of the wash away topping. And then we're going to repeat this 2 more times with your other 2 present blocks. Our present blocks are getting trimmed to a 4.5-inch square. I would take your ribbons and kind of tie them to the middle to keep them out of the way for the most part when we go to trim this. You're going to make 3 of them. And then that last cut block we just did is a 6.5-inch square. All right, and that's what we have for this week's work. You have your mug 1, presents 1 through 3. You have mitten number 1 only, and then we have star blocks 1 through 3. Okay, that is your list. I have also created a checklist for you as well for this week, so it's in the comment section here as well as in the video description for you if you'd like to. The satisfaction of check marking things off makes you a happy person. I did create that for you. And I'll see you back here next week, Wednesday, September 27th, for our next Embroider-along steps. Next week, we're going to learn about mylar, fringe, and we're going to learn about quilting the background filler blocks. Thanks, everybody. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share your finished results over on our social media.